You were 73 years old when your own son threw you out like yesterday's garbage. The reason? Simple and cruel. You had lost your job. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic tears, just the cold, metallic sound of a deadbolt sliding into place behind you. That click echoed in your chest like a gunshot, quiet, but devastatingly final. The door didn't even slam. It didn't need to, because sometimes the softest sounds can shatter a heart more completely than any thunderous roar. You stood there on the concrete steps, clutching a battered brown suitcase with white knuckles, gripping the plastic handle so tightly you could feel the ridges cutting into your palm. That suitcase contained everything you had left in this world. 3 changes of clothes, a faded photograph of your late husband, and the weight of 73 years of memories that suddenly felt worthless. Your son David stood in the doorway. Behind you, his arms crossed defensively across his chest, his eyes fixed on some invisible point over your shoulder. He couldn't bear to look at you directly. Sarah, his wife, lurked in the shadows behind him like a predator satisfied with her kill, wearing that triumphant half-smile that people get when they've finally eliminated what they see as dead weight. "You can't stay here anymore, Mom." David's voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed. "We've got kids, we've got bills piling up. We just can't afford to carry you too. I'm sorry." But his apology sounded hollow, mechanical, like coins dropping into an empty well. Nobody hugged you goodbye. Nobody asked if you had anywhere to go, if you'd be safe, if you'd eaten today. You remembered the countless nights you had skipped dinner, surviving on crackers and water, just so you could buy David his first college textbooks. You remembered working double shifts at the diner, your feet swelling in cheap shoes, your back, screaming in pain, all so he could have the future you never had. Now, you were nothing more than a financial burden with no paycheck to justify your existence. So you walked. One agonizing step at a time, dragging that suitcase behind you. It scraped against the cracked sidewalk with a grinding sound that seemed to whisper, "You're completely alone now. You have nothing. You are nothing." But what David didn't know, what nobody in this cold, indifferent world knew, was that tucked inside your worn leather purse, nestled between old receipts and coupons you'd never use, was a pristine debit card connected to a hidden bank account containing exactly $1.7 million. You didn't cry. Not when you descended those concrete steps for the last time. Not when your arthritic legs began to throb and burn as you walked the 8 blocks to the bus stop. Not even when you finally collapsed onto the cold, splintered wooden bench, your whole body aching with exhaustion and heartbreak. You just sat there, your spine curved with defeat, your gnarled hands folded protectively over your purse, watching strangers hurry past you like you were invisible, like you were already dead. And maybe, in some ways, you were. What David didn't know, what he had never bothered to ask, was that you hadn't been fired at all. You had resigned. Your doctor had been warning you for months about the damage you were doing to your spine, lifting heavy donation boxes at the church thrift store where you volunteered. He'd shown you the x-rays, pointed to the compressed vertebrae, explained in clinical terms how you were one wrong move away from permanent paralysis. So after 15 years of sorting through other people's discarded belongings, of breathing, in dust and mold, of pretending your back wasn't screaming every single day, you had quietly stepped away. Pastor Williams had begged you to stay, had offered to find you lighter duties, but you'd simply smiled and told him you needed rest. And you did. You needed to rest from a lifetime of survival, a lifetime of pretending you were stronger than you actually were. You had raised David completely alone after his father died in that horrific construction accident when David was only 8 years old. You had cleaned motel rooms where needles and worse things hid under beds. You had scrubbed hospital floors on your hands and knees until your skin cracked and bled. You had said no to new clothes, to decent food, to any small comfort, so that David could have everything he needed and wanted. You had done it all with pride, with fierce love, with the kind of determination that comes from having no other choice. But the cruelest part of motherhood, you now understood with crystal clarity, wasn't the sacrifice itself. It was the silence that followed. When the very people you had given everything to suddenly stop seeing you as human. When you became invisible to the child you had moved mountains for, You had known hunger so deep it felt like your stomach was eating itself. You had known loneliness so complete it felt like being buried alive. You had known what it meant to count pennies in a dark kitchen while the electricity flickered because you couldn't afford to pay the full bill. But this rejection from your own child, this casual disposal of your entire existence, was a kind of pain you had never imagined possible. Still, you didn't hate David. You couldn't. Hate required energy you no longer possessed. Instead, you reached into your purse with trembling fingers and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and official looking. A land deed, 35 years old, stamped and notarized and forgotten by everyone except you. 35 years ago, when your husband's life insurance payment arrived. A modest check that seemed like a fortune then but wouldn't cover a month's rent now. There had been something else tucked into that official envelope. Something the insurance company hadn't even bothered to mention. A land deed for 43 acres in the middle of nowhere, left to your husband by a great uncle nobody had ever met. Back then, everyone said it was worthless, a patch of scrubland. In the desert with no water rights, no road access, no power lines. Sell it for whatever you can get, they advised. Maybe a couple thousand if you're lucky. But you hadn't sold it. Every year you had somehow scraped together the few $100s for property taxes, even when you had to choose between that payment and groceries. You held on to it like a lifeline, whispering to yourself, just in case. Just in case. Autumn, a man in an expensive suit, had appeared at the church after Sunday service. He introduced himself as a representative from a renewable energy company. They were building a massive solar facility, and they needed that exact stretch of land, your land. The offer he made caused your knees to buckle. You asked only one question: can this transaction remain completely private? 3 weeks later, $1.7 million was quietly transferred into a trust fund managed by a nonprofit organization established in your late husband's name. To everyone around you, you were still just Cordelia, the woman with sensible shoes, secondhand sweaters, and that little floral apron you wore while serving coffee after church services. But now, for the first time in your life, you had choices. Real choices. That first night, you didn't check into a hotel or motel. Instead, you found your way to a women's shelter downtown. Not because you had to, but because you wanted to sit beside people who wouldn't judge you for what you lacked. People who understood what it meant to be thrown away by the world. You shared the few crackers you had in your purse, listened to stories that broke your heart and healed it simultaneously, laughed quietly when someone managed to find humor in their pain, and held a young mother's hand while she sobbed about children who had been taken away. For the first time in decades, you felt truly seen, truly valued. Not for what you could provide, but simply for being human. The next morning, you walked through the older part of town until you found it. A small cottage that looked like it was dying. Cracked windows, peeling paint the color of old mustard, and weeds so tall they were trying to swallow the front porch whole. You paid cash. The seller looked at you like you'd lost your mind. Over the next month, working through a shell company you called Hope Holdings LLC, you transformed that dying house into something beautiful. Fresh paint the color of summer sky, a new roof that wouldn't leak, solar panels that gleamed like mirrors, and a garden that would make angels weep. But your name appeared nowhere on any document. That was exactly how you wanted it. You didn't want revenge against David and Sarah. You didn't want the neighbors gossiping about your sudden fortune. You didn't want your son crawling back just because he discovered you had money. What you wanted was to build something that would never ever throw anyone away. So you began your quiet revolution. You volunteered at food pantries, asking innocent questions about their greatest needs, then secretly funding new refrigeration units and delivery trucks. You visited homeless shelters, noting the broken heating systems and worn mattresses, then arranging for anonymous donations to cover all repairs. When you learned that the community center where at-risk teenagers gathered was facing closure, you purchased the building through another shell company and reduced the rent to $1 per year. Finally, you found your masterpiece, an old community hall that had been boarded up for nearly a decade. You bought it and poured your heart into its restoration. You named it Cordelia's Table, though no one would ever know why. It wasn't fancy or impressive, but it radiated something more important than elegance. It radiated love. Real, unconditional love. Hot soup that could warm souls, clean beds with soft blankets, gentle music that reminded people they were still alive. It became a sanctuary for people who had nowhere else to go. People exactly like you. People who had been discarded not because they were worthless, but because they had nothing left to give. You gave anyway. Because you remembered what it felt like to be forgotten. And because somewhere deep in your heart, you still hoped that David would remember too. Remember the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. Remember that love isn't conditional on usefulness. 3 years passed like pages turning in a book you'd read before. The seasons changed quietly, predictably. The world moved on, indifferent to individual suffering. And you, well, you bloomed in the shadows, like a flower that had finally found the right soil. Cordelia's table had evolved into something miraculous. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a heartbeat, a rhythm that gave life to the entire neighborhood. Soup simmered on industrial stoves every morning, filling the air with the promise of comfort. Children played in the back garden under sunflowers that towered over their heads like golden giants. Every Friday evening, warm light spilled from the windows as the community gathered for dinner. No questions asked, no paperwork required, no judgment passed. But elsewhere, in a different part of town, life had become a series of falling dominoes. For David, it started small, a missed mortgage payment here, an overdue credit card there. Then the collection calls began. Then the foreclosure notice arrived like a death sentence. Then the locks were changed and everything he thought was permanent vanished overnight. Sarah left first, of course. She packed up the children and moved, in with her mother, claiming she needed stability and a reliable partner. David tried everything: delivery gigs that paid pennies, warehouse shifts that destroyed his back. He even sold his father's guitar for $50, but nothing stuck. Nothing was enough. Eventually, he found himself sleeping on his friend Marcus's basement couch, sharing instant noodles with cockroaches, and wondering how everything had gone so spectacularly wrong. The man who had once thrown his own mother onto the street was now experiencing the same crushing helplessness, the same desperate invisibility. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, seeking refuge from both the weather and his thoughts, David wandered into the public library. Near the circulation desk, a cream-colored flyer caught his eye. Elegant script, a small wooden logo that seemed hauntingly familiar. Cordelia's table, it read. Meals, shelter, support. No one left behind. His hands began to shake. He read the name again, certain he was hallucinating. Cordelia. It couldn't be possible, but the ache spreading through his chest suggested otherwise. He memorized the address, a street he'd walked past countless times without paying attention. The next, morning, something beyond logic pulled him across town. Call it guilt, call it desperate hope, call it the last thread connecting him to his humanity. His worn shoes carried him through neighborhoods he no longer belonged to, past lives he could no longer afford. Then he saw it. A small building painted the color of hope, surrounded by wildflowers that looked like they were dancing. Children's laughter echoed from inside. Steam curled from kitchen vents, carrying the scent of home-cooked meals. Above the front door, carved into warm wood, were words that made his vision blur. Cordelia's table. Everyone has a place. He stepped inside and was immediately enveloped by more than just warmth. He was embraced by presence, by belonging, by the kind of love he'd forgotten existed. The smell of fresh bread mixed with gentle conversation, and the soft clatter of dishes being served with care. And there, behind the reception desk, wearing a cardigan the color of autumn leaves and, with silver hair tucked behind her ears, sat a woman he hadn't truly seen in years. His mother. She looked up when he entered, her eyes widening in recognition, but she didn't flinch or retreat. She simply waited. David froze, his throat closing with emotion. Words felt like broken glass in his mouth. I didn't know where else to go, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Cordelia stood slowly, walked around the desk with measured steps, and stopped just close enough to reach out if she chose to. David couldn't meet her eyes. His entire body was shaking. "I lost the house," he said to the floor. "Sarah's gone. The kids, they won't even talk to me. I have nothing. I am nothing." Silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. Then Margaret spoke, her voice soft but steady as bedrock. "Come inside, son. You look cold." She led him to a small table near a window where afternoon light fell like a blessing. She set a mug of hot tea in front of him with hands that still shook slightly from age but moved with infinite gentleness. David looked around, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "This place, it's yours?" She nodded. "I thought you had nothing," he said, confusion and shame warring in his voice. "I had peace," she replied quietly. "And enough." His voice cracked like dry wood. "Why didn't you tell me? That you had money? That you were building this? That you were... okay?" She looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only a sadness deeper than oceans. Would it have changed anything? He couldn't answer because they both knew the truth. "I needed to know." She continued, "Who would stand by me when I had nothing to offer? That's how I learned who to build this for." "I was horrible to you," he whispered. "You trusted me with everything, and I threw you away like garbage." Cordelia reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers. Her skin was paper-thin, but warm. "You forgot yourself," she said. "That doesn't mean you can't find your way back home." In that moment, David cried. Not the angry tears of frustration he'd become accustomed to, but the healing tears of a man who had finally remembered what love actually meant. They fell quietly, steadily, washing away years of pride and selfishness and fear. Spring arrived slowly that year, like a shy animal emerging from hiding. Soft rains, tentative new leaves, and something like redemption began growing in small, quiet ways. David started volunteering at Cordelia's table. He repaired broken furniture, organized food donations, helped fix leaky pipes and squeaky hinges. He didn't ask to be paid. He simply showed up every single day, as if each hour of service could somehow balance the scales of his betrayal. Cordelia didn't say much about his presence there. She didn't need to. Every Friday evening, they sat together on the front porch, watching children play among the sunflowers, listening to the gentle hum of community dinners happening inside. No guilt, no lectures, just presence and the kind of peace that comes from forgiveness freely given. One of those golden evenings, Cordelia handed him a sealed envelope, her expression unreadable. David opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was the original deed to his childhood home, the one she'd signed over to him years ago, along with a framed copy of the check from the land sale. Both documents were mounted together like a work of art. He looked up, speechless. "You don't owe me anything," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "But now you understand. What happens when love comes before pride?" David couldn't find words. He didn't need to. For the first time in his adult life, he truly saw her, not just as his mother, not just as the woman who had packed his lunches and waited up when he was sick, but as a complete human being. Someone who had been broken by life and had still chosen kindness over bitterness, generosity over revenge. Cordelia passed peacefully in her sleep that October, surrounded by the scent of her garden and the distant sound of children playing. There were no newspaper headlines, no grand eulogies, just a simple wooden service attended by more than 200 people, folks from shelters and schools and churches, people who knew exactly who she was and what she had meant to their lives. David stood at the front of the gathering, holding her favorite apron in his hands. He took a deep breath and said softly, "My mother left a house once with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of quiet dignity. But in that silence, she built something bigger and more beautiful than any of us ever imagined." He looked up toward the doorway of Cordelia's table, where new arrivals were already being welcomed with warm soup and warmer smiles. Above the entrance, carved into the wooden arch, were the words Cordelia had written herself the day the shelter first opened its doors. The doors that close behind you can never match the ones you open for others. And David, once angry and lost, and blind to love, had finally become the man his mother always believed he could be. Not because she had been wealthy, but because she had chosen forgiveness over revenge and love over pride, proving that the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the example of how to live with grace, even when the world has forgotten your name.